slama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljo radnih ljudi. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, Tita.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. And I hope you all enjoyed the new musical selection. That's a taster of the Soviet and wider communist classics CD selection that I've put together. I know I promised to do that several weeks ago. Finally got around to actually doing it. And so that's some of the tunes you can expect to receive if you ordered one of those. So I managed to get those from a variety of places, mainly on YouTube. So there's a real selection out there if you know where to look. So we are tonight returning to the question of whether Russia is an imperialist nation or not. And I'll start off by giving the obvious answer. No. Thank you, everybody. Good night. We can all go home now. But seriously, the article I'm responding to is this one from Politsturm. There is an English translation, but it comes without the graphs attached. So if you run that through Google or Microsoft Edge, the automatic translation works pretty well. So you can get that onto your screen if you want to read through the article that I'm talking about. So it's not just, of course, Politsturm. It's also the question of whether Russia is an imperialist nation has been raised by many different political traditions that claim to be Marxist. So Politsturm claim to be Marxist-Leninist. I'm going to show you why they are not. And also, of course, Trotskyites and also, of course, Maoists. What all of them have in common, other than perhaps being fronts for various different state agencies, are a failure to actually apply the dialectical method properly. And I'll reference here a work that I was actually in a study group for just last night with other party comrades. We were talking about Stalin's work, The Foundations of Leninism. And in that work, Stalin, applying the dialectical method, looks at the question as to whether, not only whether a country is imperialist or not, but whether a struggle or a particular government is engaged in a struggle which is, objectively speaking, progressive. And it's been the argument of myself and others for a number of years now that the struggle of the Russian government in the special military operation, and certainly before that, the struggle of the workers of Donbass against the puppet regime in Kiev, is one that is clearly progressive. And flowing from that, we can also then look into the nature of the Russian state, and we did this a little bit last week when talking about whether Russia was imperialist. I thought it was worth carrying on that discussion as to whether Russia was imperialist, because the arguments keep popping up that it is, and therefore a further interrogation is necessary. Now, I found the Politsturm article to be downright dishonest, to be blunt. There's no point dancing around the obvious here. Their usage of Lenin's imperialism and trying to fit an analysis of mainly monopolization in the Russian economy just is a case of where you have removed all the meaning from Lenin's analysis. What you've done is basically they have abstracted completely and fixated upon the word monopoly. They've found the fact that there's monopolies in the Russian economy, which nobody denies, and they have found the fact that some of these monopolies do business overseas, and therefore they have also seen that there is a concentration of banking, mainly around the state now, it must be said, in the Russian Federation, and then say, look, you've got a concentration of industrial production, you have a concentration of banking capital, and some of these are merged together. There's Russia exports capital, Russia does business overseas via its monopolies such as Rosatom and Roscosmos, and therefore Russia is imperialist because it's got monopolies and it does business in overseas territories. Politsturm even make the completely ridiculous argument at one stage this is towards the end of their article, that Russia is engaged in imperialism in when it's building railways or helping modernize railway infrastructure in the DPRK. Now, if there's a country that absolutely will not accept imperialist relations from anybody, it's been the DPRK. So not only is this an inaccuracy with regard to the Russian Federation, it's also a profound insult to the struggle for sovereignty and the struggle for socialism that the DPRK has been waging for many, many years. But here's another, I want to read this ridiculous quote, and this comes about 3/4 of the way down the page in the Politsturm article. I'll read it out as follows. Quote, "The actions of the Russian Federation in Syria or support for the Maduro government are like a fight for cheap oil." So, continues, "The struggle of the Russian Federation against fascism," and the fascism, by the way, they've put in inverted commas, "in Ukraine is a struggle for a market for its products, for cheap labour resources, for the possibility of exploiting its subsoil together with the EU and the USA." So there's several mistakes that Politsturm are making in this article. One of them is the idea that the Russian Federation is actually in business, in the successful business of the division of the world, in partnership with, but sometimes rivalry with, the US imperialists. Now, we can go into that in later on in this episode, but I want to start by discounting what Politsturm argue about monopolization, or rebutting it. So they argue that the monopolization in the Russian economy signals us that this is an imperialist country. But I want to remind everybody, of course, that Lenin, and in his arguments about what constituted imperialism, made really 5 key points, which are as follows. That imperialism arises and in the later 19th century in Britain, Europe, the United States, and Japan through a combination of the following factors. The concentration of both production and capital, the merger of banking and industrial capital, and the creation of a financial oligarchy, the export of capital as opposed to commodities becoming of primary importance, and then international monopolistic unions of capitalists are formed and divide the world amongst themselves. Final point, there is the territorial division of the world by the major capitalist powers. So, let's think about this. Is the Russian Federation engaged in any of this in a serious way? And does it fit alongside the US imperialists, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Canadians, and to a certain extent the Japanese, though they are of course playing a subordinate role to US imperialism, as all of the other G7 nations are. Now, to get to the truth of this, you actually have to interrogate the history of monopolization in the Russian Federation. And this, of course, is something that Politsturm don't really do. So, what we have in the form of the monopolies in the Russian Federation are largely, in fact almost exclusively now, state-owned entities. And these emerge out of the chaos and madness of the 1990s. And at the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, you had significant entities in the energy and metals sector inside the Russian Federation that were not only privatized, but which had significant representation on their boards from the United States, from France, from Germany, and from Britain. A lot of oil fields and gas fields in the 90s and into the 2000s, and up to, in fact, the beginning of the special military operation, were projects co-run, where between the Russian government often having like a 49 to 51% shareholding of these companies, and it was a partnership with sometimes British Petroleum, I believe the French Total company were involved in some oil developments, and you had American companies involved in the aluminium business in Russia. And so you got quite a significant penetration into the Russian Federation, particularly in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, of capital exported from imperialist nations. So let us revisit for a moment the interview that Putin gave to Carlson last week and ask ourselves what we can tell from that. Because in that, Putin said a number of things. Of course, I disagreed with it. I made that clear in the reaction video. But he also gave a large amount of truth out in that video about the way in which the Russian bourgeois and their political clique, mainly the Yeltsin clique, saw things in the 90s, which is that they wanted to become essentially a subordinate part of the US-led world order. And that the subordinate part that they would be playing would be that of a provider of raw resources. And this is absolutely what they were prepared to be. And in that, they were essentially prepared to destroy a once powerful socialist state and reduce it to a ruin in order that could be ruled over by them to sell oil and gas into Europe and to the United States. This, of course, led to a disaster in the 1990s and a series of problems which we've covered many times before, so I won't reiterate here. And the Putin Bonapartist system is the result of the near collapse of that system and it having to reach several compromises with other factions within the Russian ruling class, within the Russian state, but also allowing a Bonapartist system to emerge because the ruling class proved to be completely incapable of actually running the state. They were so pathetic, they were so craven, they were so completely dominated by US imperialism at the time, and their only desire was to be an appendage of US imperialism, to turn Russia into a giant gas station. Remember John McCain's phrase, a gas station run by a dictator? Well, that's what they wanted to be, the Russian bourgeois. So what is the nature? How does this relate to the nature of monopolization in Russia? Monopolization, when you're looking at Roscosmos, which of course deals with the space-related industries, Rosatom, Rostec, these are all legacies that have been taken over by the Russian Federation from the Soviet Union. Like Rostec is this gigantic state-run firm which employs hundreds of thousands of people, as does Rosatom. And these companies are built upon the industrial legacy of the Soviet Union. How do they differ then from the monopolies in imperialist countries? And this brings us to the point of distinction. So monopolies in Germany or Britain or the USA developed through the later 19th century and into the early 20th century. The US's monopolies developed slightly behind the British and the German and the French, but they're not that far behind. Monopolies, of course, arise under capitalism because it has a natural tendency towards monopoly. So you have in Britain a lot of the big companies concentrate production through the 1850s and 60s, and so you have monopolies and, of course, the crisis of profitability, which emerges in Britain as the first capitalist nation, arising together from the 1850s and into the 1860s onwards. And this, of course, monopolization on the domestic front coincides with a increasing unprofitability of employing German or French or British labor. And you can extract, of course, far more actual profit from the export of capital overseas to either build a plant directly over which you have direct control, invest in building up a site of raw resource extraction, or building up a manufacturing center, or investing in some kind of agricultural production. So that kind of direct investment over which the investor has direct control, as in the same way they would if they invested in the home country, or very similar. But of course at a much higher rate of profit, due to the fact that the rate of exploitation that you can impose upon the worker in a colonized nation and a real regime of terror that you can impose upon those workers is much harsher than you could get away with inside Britain or France or Germany or the United States at the end of the 19th century. So that's one way that capital ends up getting exported. The other way, of course, is investment through the stock portfolios, investment into other countries via shareholdings in other enterprises. That, of course, is one of the big ways that monopolies do business these days. They often don't own, like, directly an awful lot of the companies that they extract profit from. Like, for instance, if you look at like BlackRock or the Vanguard Group or any of the other big, gigantic American monopolies that ultimately have controlling stakes or significant stakes in an awful lot of businesses, what you can see is that often they don't operate as like owner operators of a lot of enterprises overseas. They do things through shell companies, through companies that they have a controlling stake in, and then that company has a controlling stake in something else. And often the imperialists these days are 2, 3, 4 steps removed. But the extraction of a higher rate of profit is ultimately the end game. And again, sometimes this is done through direct control. More times now, American companies or British companies do it via being 3 steps removed, but still, to use the Marxist phrase, clipping the coupon at the end of the day. The bottom line is that both of these forms of imperialist actions in subjugated countries come from, they are rooted in the fact that the means of production in the home nation, for a variety of reasons, cannot be constrained by the borders of that nation. And also that the crisis of capitalist production related to, of course, the profitability of actually employing workers in the home country is such that it compels the capitalist to first invest in new plant and machinery, in new methods of production. But of course, that leads to overproduction and leads to monopolization and lack of competition, and the capitalist is pushed to find other avenues that can be hyper exploited. I have given the example before of how some companies, when they started exporting capital overseas to invest in the production, particularly of clothing, were actually employing largely women workers in places like Sri Lanka and Indonesia, using much lower methods of production than they would be in the home countries. And this goes back a long way. If you read Karl Marx in Capital Volume 1, when he's writing about the working day, he talks about how in lace manufacturing in Britain back in the 19th century, the lace manufacturers were actually opposed to the introduction of machinery because it was actually more profitable to employ gigantic numbers of ultra cheap and ultra exploitable teenage girls as manufacturers of lace, and that these girls were kept awake by a combination of tobacco and coffee and sherry, so that they could work 15, 16 hours a day sewing constantly, and some of them often got worked to death. So that's an example in the earlier days of capitalism where they could have replaced those workers with machinery, but it was more profitable for the owners of the lace making company to employ a gigantic amount of ultra exploitable labor. The same practice takes place by the monopolies overseas. Point about all of this is that monopolization in the imperialist countries arises because the productive forces develop to a certain point and then can be developed no further for that variety of reasons I've just started to go through. So let's come back then to Russian monopolization and the monopolization in the Russian economy, which takes off under the Putin system, because Putin and his group, when they form this Bonapartist regime, are forced to come to the conclusion that unless they actually combine a lot of these old state-run industries, which have been deprived of investment, had been partially asset stripped by private owners when they were in private hands, or deprived of budgets when they stayed in state hands. And so to actually revitalize this, they had to or protect the industries they did have, particularly at first in oil and gas, but then later in, of course, space-related industries. The tremendous potential that still lies within the the Russian atomic energy industry, and also with the military production. To preserve those, they had to combine them together, rationalize them, and combine them into these gigantic state monopolies. So the monopolization there takes a much different route to the route that is taken by all the other imperialist countries. What you've got there is not the fact that the means of production in Russia are outstripping the national boundaries of the state, and therefore you get monopolization, a merger of industrial with money capital to create finance capital. That's not what went on. What went on was the fact that the Russian government under Putin came to the realization they were going to lose all these industries. They were going to be destroyed if they carried on the way that they were. So monopolization under state ownership or majority state control was imposed essentially to stop them from disappearing, because that was the agenda of the imperialists in the 90s, which of course the comprador bourgeois in Russia were more than happy to cooperate with, which is that their industries should all be annihilated other than those that were of direct usage to the imperialists, mainly related to the extraction of oil and gas and aluminium and other rare earth metals that exist beneath the soil of Russia. So monopolization there is not, repeat, not because the productive forces are outgrowing the territorial boundaries of the Russian Federation. It is a move to preserve what they already had in the form of the Soviet industrial legacy. And this process takes a long time, and it's really only come to full fruition in recent years. But slowly through the 2000s and into the 2010s, you start to see the public monopolization of these industries grow and grow, and the amount of the Russian economy that is actually classified as being publicly owned grow. Now, various different estimates were made at the beginning of 2022 as to how much the Russian economy was state-run. The consensus figure, if you look at various different sources, so Federal Anti-Monopoly Service in Russia itself claimed that the state sector doubled to being 70% of GDP by 2014. The IMF claimed that it was only 33% in 2016, and others claimed it was around about 46% also in 2016. I think if you look at it now, the state sector in Russia probably composes at least 50%, probably higher, of GDP. Again, though that is a different way of progression than all the other imperialist countries. And again, like, it's done by necessity to stop these industries getting annihilated. And again, to draw something from what Putin himself has said, he actually oversaw a policy disaster when he was prime minister, which is that they opened up the aircraft industry to competition from the British, the Americans, the French, and the Germans, and the Russian domestic aircraft industry got annihilated without state protection, because the monopolists of the imperialist countries simply flooded the market with their products and outcompeted the domestic Russian products. And Putin reflected, it was in one of his speeches, I think it was the end of 2022 to the Valdai Club, that it was an enormous mistake. The whole question of whether Russia is imperialist or not revolves around the point I'm making here, which is this a case of the productive forces outgrowing the national boundaries? No. Is this a case that Russian domestic capital starts exporting itself because it can no longer make enough profit off the employment of Russian workers? The answer is also no. And so for Politsturm and others to treat Russian monopolies as if they had been formed or were coming into existence for the same reasons and were formed in the same way as the monopolies in imperialist countries, that is not a serious analysis in the slightest, because it comes about in a completely different way. Now, here we turn to the fact that Politsturm argue that, well, Russia is imperialist, but is imperialist mainly because, well, also because of the monopolization. You also have export of capital. But then let us turn to the export of capital. And the export of capital, where does it go in terms of where the Russian ruling class is sending its money? So the principal destination for capital exported from Russia is not another foreign market. It's not being invested in places to turn a profit by the hyper-exploitation of other sources of labor. It's Cyprus, followed by the British offshore banking industry. Those are the two primary places where Russian capital goes. Now, why is that? That's because the Russian capitalist class, being a completely parasitic and degenerate bunch, want to make sure that as much of their capital as possible is outside of the country, stashed in Cypriot banks and stashed in the offshore banking industry ultimately controlled by London. And this comes back in terms of where's the biggest external investor in Russia for a long time? The answer was capital coming in from Cyprus. Well, is that because the Greek Cypriots in the South Cyprus banking industry are very rich and keen on investing in Russia? No, it's capital that's moving into and out of Cyprus from the Russian ruling class. That's where the primary exports of Russian capital go to. So by looking at that, you can see that this is a different situation entirely. Whatever one can say about the British ruling class, and you can say an awful lot, it wasn't the case that they were investing, they were stashing their money in banks when they were engaging in imperialism. They were making investments in largely British colonies to reap gigantic profits from by a hyper-exploitation of labour. They were a serious and ambitious group. But one cannot say the same of the Russian ruling class. They are a completely degenerate class. Whereas the British were cruel and efficient, the Russian capitalist class came late into the world the first time round and came far too late into the world the second time round, brought back into it via catastrophic failures of revisionism and the collapse of the Soviet state. So again, when you look at export of capital, what is it being done for? It's being done to evade taxes. It's being done to park the money in places where the state can't get to it. It's being done also in terms of the export of capital into places like London and Paris and New York, as we've said before, it's got various Russian capitalists investing or parking their money in assets, mainly property. So again, that is not what the American ruling class was doing in the period of imperialism. It's not what the American ruling class is doing now with their export of capital. Yes, they stash it in banks sometimes and buy a lot of property, but principally they're after a profit. And that's the reason why they engage in the imperialist actions that they do. So again, like Politsturm and others who say, oh, well, Russia exports capital, Russia must be imperialist. Yeah, they export capital to banks where it can't be touched by the state, and the Russian state has continued to allow them to do this. So what about other things? Like if you're going to track the progress of what is, according to Politsturm and others, Russian imperialism, surely then Russia is then competing with the US imperialists in terms of getting some of the largest companies in the world, or like building up their companies into some of the largest in the world. Well, if you look at the leaders in terms of the largest companies in the world, as ranked by the Forbes Fortune 500 list, which is the list that they put together every year by Forbes, and they count the various different companies that are attached to various different nations and see who's in the lead, basically. So out of the top countries in the world that are have like the most enormous companies, the United States has the most because the number of companies registered as being like global and transnational in the United States by Forbes amounts to 590. This is out of the 2,000 largest companies in the world. China, 351. Japan, 196. So what about Russia then? Where are they on the list? Now, of the the total on the list of Russian companies, of the gigantic company, 2,000 biggest companies in the world, Russia only has Gazprom in 42nd place, Lukoil in 50th, Rosneft in 86th, and Sberbank 255th. So out of 2,000 of the biggest companies in the world, Russia has 4 free energy companies and a bank. That's below all of the major imperialist countries. It's below all of the G7, certainly below China as well. And an awful lot of the Chinese companies there are also state-owned enterprises. Not all of them, though, by any means. So if looking at that, Russia is far below where all of the G7 countries are. And these are all, of course, countries which were historically imperialist and still are, but they'll have a diminished role these days thanks to their relative decline over the decades. So again, Russian monopolization does not fit with all the previous patterns of monopolization in the imperialist countries. Its export of capital is overwhelmingly to bank accounts, often in tax havens. And its alleged gigantic transnational companies barely register a flicker on the list of the 2,000 biggest companies in the world, according to Forbes. So, flat out wrong, basically. If we're judging this by the way in which imperialism and imperialist countries come about and the way in which they behave, this is simply incorrect. Like, it doesn't fit with any of the measurements which a Marxist would use properly to judge whether a country is imperialist or not. So what then is the nature of Russia? The truth is that you have in Russia, again, a capitalist class that proved to be so pathetic and so utterly incapable of taking the nation forward that even pro-capitalist politicians like Putin, and he is, after all, a Russian liberal, was forced time and time again by the ineptitude, parasitism, and all-around uselessness of the Russian capitalist class to repeatedly extend the frontiers of the state economy to take over areas to redevelop them. And again, he oversaw his own disastrous policy failures, such as when he was prime minister over the airline industry, and basically had to be kicked in the bollocks repeatedly by the US imperialists over and over again before he and others in the ruling circle finally came to realize, oh shit, they don't want partnership of any kind. Now, again, let us go back to the role the Russian ruling class had assigned to themselves, which is that, and again, Putin reflected this in his early years, they wanted to be a player in the global order that was led by the United States. And they fought, why they fought this is anybody's guess, wishful thinking, I think, mainly, that if they agreed to be the primary source of raw resources for principally Europe, that essentially the US would allow them to make their money and would leave them alone. And that they would be invited in to the G7, as we saw in our previous episode, Yeltsin and the G7 plus one. They did call it the G8 for a little while, but it was never official. There was never any formal extension of the G7 to include Russia. It was, as Tony Blair, our unlamented former prime minister, observed in a confidential memo, it was a placating of Russia. It was an attempt to make Yeltsin feel important, like he was getting somewhere. And that's what they were doing all the way through the 90s, which is that they were pretending to bring the Russian ruling class in, but what they were actually doing was, well, exactly what Mikhail Khodorkovsky was engaged in. And he was, of course, an asset of the CIA and MI6, which is planning to take power in Russia, get rid of Putin, and institute their ultimate plan for Russia, which was, of course, the absolute annihilation of every form of industry, making sure that their products completely dominated Russia internally. So you annihilate every form of industry in Russia other than those involved immediately with the extraction of oil and gas. And you make sure also that most of the the machinery you use for that, most of the means of production is not produced domestically in Russia, but it's produced by your monopolies and then brought into Russia and assembled there. So again, if the plan had come off, and it nearly did, by the US imperialists and the British principally, but the French and the Germans were in on this as well. It was the case that what they wanted to do was to make sure that Russia was like an almost industry-free place. The entire country given over to the production of oil, gas, and the extraction of metals. And all of this would be controlled in majority form by the monopolies of America, Britain, France, Germany, to a certain extent Italy as well. And they would cut the Russian government in, if they got their man, Khodorkovsky, in. They would cut the Russian government in. The Russian government would retain probably like 20, maybe 30% of the shares in most of these companies, but most of it would be turned over to the monopolies. They would have a controlling stake, or at least a dominant stake, in all of these companies that they would still allow to exist inside Russia. So why didn't this work is the question. And the answer comes to us in several different forms. The role played by the historic legacy of the Soviet Union is important here, because even though Putin likes to go back to Peter the Great, Alexander III, Ivan IV, various other czars, for the purposes of his anti-communist audience inside Russia, well, in actual fact, one of the reasons why this didn't work was because of the strength of the Soviet legacy. Not just the industrial strength and the military strength, but also the strength of the Soviet legacy inside the minds of the Russian working class and even elements in the Russian petty bourgeoisie, even some minor elements of the Russian ruling class, though by no means the dominant part. They remembered a time when, of course, the US imperialists were obliged to treat the former Soviet Union seriously. And treating them seriously was certainly not what was going on in the early 2000s. And this, of course, was a motivating factor for many Russians in resisting the appeals of the compradors headed by people like Khodorkovsky, wanting to portraying themselves as these great democratic liberals, and why the Putin government was forced to change course in order to preserve basic elements of Russian sovereignty. Because without that, they would have ended up basically like a colonized nation, far worse even than the days of the Tsar in the late 19th and early 20th century, where Russia was essentially becoming both a power that was involved in the acquisition or the attempted acquisition of colonial possessions. That's what the Russian bourgeois were interested in, but also one that was dominated by Western imperialism. So they were being reduced to a situation where they would have been even worse off than they were under the old Tsardom system. So the legacy of the Soviet Union prevented that. The legacy in industrial terms, which was too strong to be liquidated completely by the compradors in the 90s. Also the strength of resistance from the working class as well in certain areas. And the fear of the what you might call like the security officer group around Putin, that if they continued this way, that there would be nothing left. So at each stage, Putin and his group have tried to do two things. They've tried to make the Russian capitalist class actually invest more. They haven't put any restrictions on them, or not many. The only restriction was that they should not try and take over the running of the state directly. They could continue to loot the country via the export of capital and the export of capital to Cyprus and London and other places like that. So they tried to, at each stage, get them to invest and failed to do so. They tried at each stage to reach a lasting settlement with the US imperialists. But and this, again, we go back to the 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference. That's what Putin's saying. He's saying, essentially, you allow us into your system, but you have to negotiate with us. We're not prepared to just play the role of doormats. But that wasn't enough. That's why McCain and Joe Lieberman at the time, if you remember him, were sat there laughing away at him. Who's this guy coming to tell us that we should negotiate with him? And again, like the strength of the Soviet political and industrial legacy and the ability of the Russian government to change course, again, derives from that strength. And even though Putin will disparage the communist era and mock the great heroic founders of the Soviet Union, or try to disparage them, well, his project in terms of protecting Russian sovereignty only worked because of the Soviet legacy. All of this only works because of the Soviet legacy. And the fact that they've been able to build on that in industrial terms to the point where now they can slowly start to move towards elements, they've moved into elements of self-sufficiency, is a crucial part of the legacy they inherited from the USSR. So these anti-communists who started their careers as lieutenants to Sobchak and Yeltsin and others have ended up, through the torturous process of being, again, assailed repeatedly by imperialism in the most aggressive fashion, they ended up in a place where they have to oppose it. But to return to the subject of the discussion this evening, the assertion that Russia is imperialist can only be made if you distort Lenin's method of analysis, if you distort his analysis as to why monopolies come about, if you ignore where the actual destinations for capital exported from the Russian Federation actually are, and if you ignore the fact that the Russian government has been trying for 25 years now to find a place within the American-led, the US-led international rules-based international order, but was denied one, because the only place they would be allowed was not as some sort of partner. And this comes to the question of the imperialist powers dividing the world amongst themselves. The Russian ruling class were more than prepared to take a subordinate role, but weren't even going to be allowed that. They were going to be reduced to nothing and hyper-exploited to death. Well, not them, but there's certainly the Russian working class were. The only future imperialism had in mind for them was essentially wage slavery, hyper-exploitation, and ruin of their nation. And it certainly wasn't the case that this was like the scramble for Africa, where Britain, France, Germany, and Italy come together to divide the spoils amongst themselves. No, Russia was on the menu to be the spoils. That's very different. They were trying to negotiate with the one dominant leading imperial power in the world, the imperial power that has subordinated all of the other imperialist powers to its will. They were trying to negotiate with them and found that they couldn't. And that is very different to Britain and Germany having to bargain with each other at the end of the 19th century, ultimately in a way that did not work, and ultimately led to World War I. But you couldn't say that Britain and Germany, that one was subordinated to the other. These were both strong imperialist powers battling with each other. What you get with Russia is a country which is battered and half destroyed by its own ruling class, trying to negotiate with the most powerful imperialist nation in the world, and only really being able to resist because of the Soviet industrial and military legacy, and also the strength of the memory of the Soviet Union and many of the former Soviet peoples, including, of course, the people in the Donbass, which was once Eastern Ukraine. So under all of the categorizations outlined by Lenin, the 5 major categorizations, Russia is simply not an imperialist power by any of those definitions. And as to the claim made by Politsturm that they're after the cheap oil in Syria and Venezuela, I mean, it's such a ludicrous assertion to make. If there's one thing that the Russians don't need is more oil. Why would they need the Syrian oil deposits? Those are tiny. They're like the Americans are stealing them, but they're not significant. Why would they need the Venezuelan oil deposits? Again, like their own oil deposits are more than enough to make gigantic profits on the international market. So then again, the question comes up of, well, what is behind the Russian intervention in Syria? Well, partly it was the Russian government responding to a request from a long-standing ally. And also it was because there had been a conclusion reached by the ruling group in Russia, particularly after the Libyan intervention and the destruction of Libya, that if they didn't act soon, that they would be on the menu pretty shortly for the same treatment. That if they continued to allow the US to go on this rampage from, of course, Yugoslavia in the 90s, Afghanistan, Iraq, and then, Yemen via Saudi Arabia, but also then Libya and then Syria. If they didn't stop them at Syria, then they would be next one way or the other. Not directly. Bear in mind also that this comes immediately after the coup in 2014. So the Russian intervention in Syria starts seriously in 2015. So they've realized that the US imperialists are coming for them and aren't going to stop. And therefore, they needed to make counter moves. And that's fortunate for the Syrians because they were able to get assistance and stop the jihadist proxy takeover that would have taken place there were it not for Russian assistance. And so is Russia then intervening in Syria for the purposes of cheap labor and cheap oil? Well, in both cases, no. They certainly don't need the cheap oil. And if anything, the intervention in Syria, though it has not been tremendously costly, is certainly a financial outlay that has cost them more than it would have done otherwise, but it's an investment principally in Russian security. And if you look at their involvement in Venezuela, again, why get involved there? Well, partially it's because they need to make counter moves against the Americans. And that's benefited the Venezuelans because they've received valuable security assistance and intelligence assistance from the Russian Federation. But ultimately, that again was a counter move because remember what Gorbachev said back in his wretched book, Perestroika, which is basically where he offered to have the Soviet Union abandon the anti-imperialist struggles in South America and sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of Southeast Asia. Now remember, Gorbachev was expressing the views of the comprador bourgeoisie that had grown up inside the Soviet Union. And Putin, and whatever we may think of his system, and I certainly have a lot of criticisms, rendered active assistance to anti-imperialist forces in Syria and in Venezuela when he didn't strictly, the Russian government didn't have to, but they chose to make a counter move because, again, the Americans were making so many aggressive maneuvers around Russia and had been for decades that they had to engage in some kind of countermeasure to give the Americans something else to think about. And having a valued allies in Cuba and Venezuela, of course, certainly provides opportunities for the Russians. And it's been beneficial for both of those countries. And so Putin has proven, via the twists and turns of history, to be a man who has undone at least certain elements of the foul and fetid legacy of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. Probably not what he intended, Putin, when he started out his career in the presidency, but it is what he has ended up doing. And where credit is due, we must, of course, provide it. So, reaching the conclusion. The argument that Russia is an imperialist power can only be made, as I said, by willfully distorting Lenin's method and willfully distorting Marxism itself, by making assertions which cannot be backed up by meaningful data, and by ignoring the entire history of the development of the distorted and rather weak capitalist class in Russia itself. And that is what Politsturm have done, it's what the British Trotskyites have done, it's what the American Trotskyites have done. It's why these idiots can't go into detail when you actually try and engage them with a point, and why they have to start babbling and screaming about imperialism and oppression and decolonize this, that, or the other without understanding any of the words. Because the facts are on the side of a Marxist-Leninist analysis, and that is what I have endeavored to provide this evening and, of course, on other previous episodes of the program. Right. I will take a brief sip of what tonight is water. I swear it's not vodka. So, let us now return to the comments that have come in so far. I'll greet everybody who has arrived and catch up on comments. Right. Good evening to Otis and Jason UK Red. Have I seen Dugin's analysis on Tucker and MAGA communism? No, I haven't. Though I am following Dugin on Telegram. Maybe I'll catch up with it there. Jay says, off the road early today and settling in here with some tea. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well today. I hope you are well too, comrade. Tom says, I've been really enjoying these streams. Good to have you with us. Peter, good evening to you in the land of ever perfidious Albion. Guy, a good morning to you out there in Brazil. Red Star Betty, good evening from the perpetually rainy People's Republic of Durham, or is it the People's Republic of Northumbria? Solidarity to Muzzlepaint, who joins us, who's taking a break from reading Wretched of the Earth. Well, good stuff. D.E. joining us from Hampshire. Adam Marks, good to see you here. Kent, good afternoon to you out there in Minneapolis. Jenny, good afternoon to you. Glad you're enjoying the new tunes. And Tim Gray, yes, I've put a couple of links in the chat to answer your question about North Korea. There's more. I did get your email, but I will be replying to it from the editor address. So there's more books to be linked to. I will be replying to you shortly. Okay, Comrade Hello Hi. Good evening to you. Jerry, who joins the Hampshire contingent. Ian Foster, good evening to you, Comrade. Gleb Perch, who joins us from KK, California. And we've got Lee, who joins us. And hello to Tusker. Hope you're enjoying the program. Albert, hello to you. President Jesus in the land of Gavin Newsom. And we've got Christopher Romero, who joins us from the US. We have Irish Partisan joining us on the metro line home out there in Minsk, Belarus. Alda Larkin, who joins us from Dublin, where I'll be on Thursday. And we've got some comments coming here from Albert, who says, I know an old Trotskyist who claims to be a communist, but somehow his ideas are aligned with NATO and the USA. I doubt very much he's in the pay of the state, as he is piss poor. This faulty theory. Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I jest that Trotskyites are in the pay of the state. I think some of them are, the people at the very top of the organizations. I was a Trotskyite for a while. I don't think I was in the pay of the state technically because I was working in the British Civil Service, so maybe I was more deep cover than I realised. But no, it's not just that you're being paid by the state to do it. It's a bad theory leading to a bad practice. And again, I did 3 programs on my journey from Trotskyism to Marxist-Leninism. Maybe we should do some streams on that in the future. Right. On any sundry mule, who says Privyet, and I'll say that right back to you. Munis, good evening. Hello to Slava, and I recorded a discussion with Slava earlier today that's going out on Thursday, covering Putin's version of history and some critiques of that. I'm sure you'll appreciate that when it comes out. Vinicius Torreson, another viewer in Brazil. Excellent stuff. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already, comrades. Comrade Hello Hi says the only socialist states are East Anglia, Antarctica, the Australian outback. They follow the example of Shrek's Pizza and Pangea. I have no idea what a lot of that stuff meant. Yep X says that you wish you were smart and informed. Unfortunately, my TBI prevents me from retaining and articulating what I've consumed, but I still try my best regardless, even with this disability. Well, you will probably retain more than you realize. I'm not an expert in these things, believe me. But you're here tonight joining the discussion, and I'm sure you're getting something out of it. And your appearance here is always appreciated. So good to have you with us. Sterlitz says there's a link to part 1. Well, this only became a part 2 after it became obvious that part 1 wasn't adequate on its own. So I will be relabeling part 1 and putting it on a playlist when I do some editing of the streams tomorrow. Right, okay. And I echo what Peter says in reply to YepX. Peter says, you're here and taking part even with your injury means you've got a good-hearted and brave comrade in my books. Well said. British-owned gold mines in Siberia. Yep, that was says Red Star Betty. Yeah, that was the reason for a lot of British interventions in the Russian Revolution. Or trying to crush the Russian Revolution. I heard the Yanks are stealing Syrian oil purely to prevent Syria from benefiting from it, says Jerry. Yeah, principally it's that. I mean, Trump says, we're taking the oil. We're going to take it all. It's ours. But it's not really that the US needs Syrian oil in the global marketplace. It's principally to cripple the Syrian government and to retain their presence there. One can only hope that they are driven from the place very soon. Irish Partisan says, I see the KPRF are campaigning to have the ultra-leftist Boris Kargalitsky to be released. What is my opinion of this? Well, I mean, Kargalitsky, as far as I'm aware, is a rather silly sociologist who's basically a bit of a trot, and the Russian authorities have locked him up. There's far more dangerous people than him floating around in Russia. I think the KPRF are seeing it as basically that this guy's obviously, he's clearly not in the pay of NATO. He's essentially like a harmless crank. And also the KPRF have their bigger case, which is, of course, the locking up of Sergei Udaltsov. So, I mean, I'm sure they have their reasons for campaigning for the release of Kargalitsky. I don't know if he's connected to them in some way. I don't think he is. But I think that they see it. I think they see it as they're pushing against the usage of the 1993 Constitution, because I know that's a point the KPRF make a lot, that the Russian government is still acting under the Yeltsin Constitution, which gives it an awful lot of Bonapartist powers. Most of the time they don't use them, but I know that the KPRF wants to fundamentally change that constitution and get rid of some of the arbitrary powers that the state has, which are also used against the KPRF in various regions of Russia. If you look at the KPRF's Telegram and their website, they're frequently complaining about harassment from the authorities, because of course Russia is this gigantic state where these anti-communist officials from United Russia that run some of these places frequently choose to conduct anti-communist harassment of the KPRF. So maybe they're seeing the prosecution of Kargalitsky as being done on similar grounds to that of Udaltsov. I think they've also defended Strelkov at various different points, even though he's very far away from how they see it, how they see things. So I would see it in that context, that it's a part of their wider campaigning against the 93 Constitution, or the Yeltsin Constitution, and the arbitrary powers that it gives, and also that they clearly don't see Kargalitsky as being some sort of foreign agent. And we should always remember the KPRF as were the Russian Communist Workers' Party, led by Viktor Chulkin. They were far ahead of United Russia and the Kremlin in calling for the beginning of the special military operation. They were both calling for it from 2014 onwards, as was, I believe, Udaltsov, who is also locked up. All right. Good evening to Tristan out in Maryland, and C. Bolt, and Stanislav Tomov, who joins us from Bulgaria. Good to have you with us. Irish Partisan says Russian ultra-leftism is an infantile disorder. Do you believe that these ultra-lefts are deliberate in their support of US imperialism? It depends on the ultra-leftists, really, Irish Partisan. Some of them are, I mean, some of the Russian trots. I met a couple years ago at a Trotskyite summer school in Belgium, would you believe it, in Ghent. And I ran into some Russian trots there. They were basically what you would regard now as fairly standard sort of Soros funded blue-haired art school kids from upper petty bourgeois or just outright bourgeois Russian families who were engaging in some sort of phony rebellion for a few years. There was no workers associated with these organizations at all. I believe the Trotskyite section of the group I was in disappeared in the mid-2010s when some guy involved stole all the money, if I'm recalling that correctly. So, yeah, I mean, Russian Trotskyism is a joke, largely aligned with US imperialism. Russian Maoism, fairly similar. I don't know precisely what Kargilitsky has said. I imagine it's something rather silly. But if the KPRF are confident that he's not some kind of foreign agent, on that, given their track record of pushing for the SMO, I'm happy to accept their judgment because they know the case far better than I do. Martin, good afternoon to you. Good to have you with us. Thoughts on Robert Griffiths? Well, I've met Robert Griffiths, so if you don't know who he is, he's the long-time General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain, no brackets, not very communist, not much of a party, and barely even in Britain. My thoughts on him, standard revisionist, nothing much to say really. I mean, I've met him once, it wasn't particularly impressive. His leadership of the CPB has been disastrous because he's basically maintained the same revisionist garbage line that they've kept from the old CPGB, which led to that party ultimately becoming heavily influenced by Eurocommunism, then collapsing into irrelevance and splitting up. So again, as a leadership that's basically just gone nowhere. It's bound the Communist Party of Britain hand and foot to the Labour Party, and the only place it has any real presence is within the trade union bureaucracy. No, I'm not going to do an impression of him because I can't remember what he sounds like. Plus, he's Welsh, isn't he? And I know we've got Welsh viewers, and my Welsh accent could be regarded as racist. Rianne, who joins us from the Socialist Republic of Wales. Good job I didn't do the impression. Good to have you with us. Just tuned in, says Dan Lindstrom. Talk about the Trotskyism journey. I will in a future episode. The Russian Maoist Party is interesting, says Comrade Hello Hi. Well, I'll take your word for it. I haven't looked into them. Okay, so we are just about an hour in, and I think that brings us to a neat conclusion for tonight's stream. Tomorrow night, I will be venturing into the interesting territory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. That was my plan anyway, but that may change. I may do that on Friday of this week. Given the interest in the from Trotskyism to Marxist-Leninism journey, I may start with that tomorrow night, depending upon audience enthusiasm. So let me know which one of those you'd like to see tomorrow. I can do the stream on from Trotskyism to Marxist-Leninism fairly easily because I've got all of the arguments basically burnt into my brain. So if you want to see that, do let me know. Any questions, write to the following email address. It's editor at marxengelsinstitute.org. I'll just put the email address in the chat so you can all see it. So there seems to be a consensus of enthusiasm, shall we say, for the from Trotskyism to Marxist-Leninism live stream tomorrow. So, okay. There's also enthusiasm from Martin for the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Well, that will be done. I think what we'll do is, for the rest of the week, from Trotskyism to Marxist-Leninism journey, that one can be done tomorrow. And then tendency of the rate of profit to fall on Friday, and the interview discussion with Slava about Ukrainian history and Putin's version of things will go out on Thursday. So tomorrow night we are back on at 10:30 in the evening, British time, of course. And I've just realised I've twirled the microphone away from myself too early. So yeah, 10:30 tomorrow, British time. We will be back on talking about from Trotskyism to Marxist-Leninism. So be sure to join me for that one. And then I'll see you again live after that on the Friday. But thank you to everybody who's tuned in, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.